McWilliams is a graduate of the University of Southern California and has developed expertise in the fields of labor, and agricultural, and minority group affairs. Served 4 years as California State Commissioner of Immigration and Housing and was twice awarded Guggenheim Fellowships. Mr. Williams has been with the staff of the Nation magazine since 1945 and has been editor since 1955. Mr. Williams. Mr. McWilliams, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think about the only advantage that I can think of in being an ex-Californian is the great pleasure it gives one always to return to California. I've been absent from the state for about 14 years. Seems like an incredible span of time to me in retrospect. But I have been able to get back at least once a year, so I've been able to maintain a kind of connection with this state. I was asked to speak to you about automation and some of the problems in connection with automation this morning. And first of all, I should like to say to you that my interest in this subject is not that of an economist, it's not that of an engineer, it's not that of a technician who really knows anything about automation as a system. My interest in the subject is that of a working journalist. And as you may or may not know, there are many definitions of the profession of journalism. And because I have a kind of morbid interest in the subject, I collect these definitions. I now have something like 60 definitions, all of them, I'm happy to say, splendidly derogatory. And the one I like best is Edwin Leahy's definition, Mr. Leahy being of the Chicago Daily News. Mr. Leahy says that the essence of journalism is superficiality. And of course he's quite right, because journalism does deal with the surface of events and the surface of news. And if it weren't dealing with that, it wouldn't be journalism. I suppose it would be history or sociology or something of that sort. So my interest in this subject is that of a journalist watching the surface of the news and trying to see what are some of the implications of this problem of automation. Now, I was impressed about a year ago this time. I sat in on a conference of the National Industrial Conference Board in New York and on automation and problems of automation. And one of the speakers at this most conservative management conference group said that we have arrived at a kind of moment of truth with regard to automation, that this moment of truth has come upon us suddenly and that it finds us quite unprepared to deal with some of the consequences of automation. I think this is true, and I think one of the reasons that it finds us unprepared is, first of all, in connection with this word, automation. In some respects, it's a misleading word. So far as I can determine, it was first used by Mr. Harder, a vice president of Ford Motor Company in 1948. And Mr. Harder was watching the performance of certain automatic transfer machines that had just then been installed in a Ford plant. And he was very much impressed with them, and having seen them in action, he said, what we need is some more automation. And at that time, he was speaking about automatic transfer machines. And that's why, it seems to me, he said automation. However that may be, the term is slightly misleading because it seems to suggest a further dimension of mechanization. And mechanization being something with which we have been quite familiar, this didn't seem to be very disturbing. And 1948, as you will note, is not so very far back in time. And the other interesting thing is that not only was this term automation a bit misleading in that it was first applied to automatic transfer machines, and then in the wake of this we began to get closed or loop circuit communication systems, and then in the wake of that, computers, and you put together automatic transfer machines, closed or loop circuit communications, and computers, and you get really the totality of the process that is automation. But this, you see, came in stages, and it didn't happen all at once, and we were somewhat, our apprehensions were perhaps somewhat stifled or muted by this odd term. Then I think the other thing to note about this is the speed with which this revolution in production has gone forward. Just to give you a very dramatic illustration, or what impresses me as a dramatic illustration of the time factor, let me tell you about a ceremony that was enacted in Washington on October 3rd, 1963. It was a meeting held in the office of the Bureau of the Census in Washington, a memorial service, it was called, to UNIVAC the First. And UNIVAC the First had been, was the first of the large electronic data processing machines. It had been in operation 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, since it had been installed. But between 1951 and 1963, it had become a machine of the past. And as a consequence of this, there was this interesting memorial service in which the director of the Bureau of the Census said, "We are gathered here today, if I may use the term of another ceremony, to note the passing of UNIVAC the First." Now, it has occurred to me that he might as well, or perhaps have better said, "We are gathered here today to witness the passing of an old world and the birth of a new world," because the symbolic significance of this shift was almost that great. The new model machines, for example, are 100 times faster than UNIVAC the First, and they are about 1 million times faster than the fastest clerk. They operate today on an impulse cycle of 3 millionths of a second. And so in a decade's time, UNIVAC the First had become very old hat indeed. Now, I want to suggest to you that this transformation of our processes of production has come upon us not only very suddenly, but that it is in many respects quite unlike the similar transformation of production that came with the Industrial Revolution. And I want to suggest to you in what respects I think it is quite different. First of all, however, I would like to offer you Bernard Karsh's definition of automation, which I think is certainly an operative definition. Mr. Karsh, as you know, is at the University of Illinois. He defines automation as the accomplishment of a work task by an integrated power-driven mechanism entirely without the direct application of human energy, skill, intelligence, or control. Now, I suggested a moment ago that this new process of production differs in substantial ways from the Industrial Revolution. Let's take a look at some of these differences. In the first place, the application of these new mechanisms is much broader. The steam engine, which was the characteristic machine of the Industrial Revolution, had, after all, a limited number of applications. But there is literally no limitation, or hardly any limitation, to the processes to which these new machines can be put. They are enormously versatile. And this, I think, is one of the most interesting aspects of them. The engineers who work in this field tell me that as long as a job can be meaningfully described in a set of written instructions, it can be automated. And this includes a great many jobs indeed. So that today, for example, we have some marvelous new typesetting mechanisms operated by perforated type that have within their potentiality the possibility of, for example, a global newspaper being published within by the end of this decade. An extraordinary kind of development. We have automated mail sorters and weather forecasting mechanisms and libraries that would service, for example, a community of 500,000 people. Libraries reduced to the compass of an ordinary-sized vending machine, and novels as large as Tolstoy's War and Peace, reduced to the compass of a postage stamp. with instant retrieval mechanisms involved, and sketch pads that are, or so I'm told, going to be of enormous utility to designers, making it possible for designers to operate without building specific models in each instance of what it is they want to do. And completely automated factories in bakeries, in steel, in auto, and in chemicals. This McLuth strip steel rolling mill in Detroit, for example, is a marvel of automation. Conducts about 190 separate readings and gives directions based upon these readings. And not so long ago, I had occasion to take a look at this Sara Lee Bakery in Deerfield, Illinois, a completely automated bakery. It monitors storage facilities, adjusts temperatures, controls blends and mixtures, computes and monitors time cycles, keeps books, bills the customer, also does market analysis and research, will execute 180,000 warehouse instructions every 3 minutes, if you please, and monitors some 300 process variables, a completely automated plant. And in addition to this, in Arlington Heights, Illinois, a kind of preview of what an automated farm would be like. This is a farm that has installed glass-on-steel silage towers. Very expensive at the present time, but presumably they will not be so expensive in the future. They make it possible, for example, for one man to operate a 540-acre alfalfa grain livestock farm by himself. He fixes the mix in these silos by operating a console. The new silos are oxygen-free, and they adjust to temperature changes and so forth, so that you have in process here, or in a certain miniature way, an idea of what a large-scale automated farm might be like. And then, of course, vending machines. Nowadays, a $3 billion industry with something like $4 million vending machines actually in operation in the United States today. And the engineers who function in this field tell me that the formula on which they operate is that anything that can be, as they put it, popped, propelled, or squirted can be sold by a vending machine. So that nowadays we're selling through vending machines instant martinis, infrared toasted sandwiches, sales dispensers that sell 36 varieties of products and make change up to $5 and handle paper money, if you please. Now, this is an amazing development considering the fact that up to the end of World War II, vending machines were largely restricted to the sale of cigarettes, chewing gum, and candy, but no more. And in addition, of course, we have the automated ships, automated railroad yards, the impact of automation on medical research, on legal research, on scientific research is going to be very great indeed. And in addition, with these new, smaller computers, all kinds of uses are indicated. For example, a kind of household computer in which you can program all of the items that enter into the budget of an ordinary household, including the keeping of income tax records and the budgeting of the household expenditures, and even keeping your bank book in balance. Now, I have some doubts in my own case that this would be an altogether desirable innovation. But however that may be, these are potentialities of the moment. Now, so much for the versatility, the amazing range and scope of these new processes and these new machines. But automation differs from the Industrial Revolution in a second significant respect, namely that it is spreading far more rapidly than the Industrial Revolution spread. It's been estimated, for example, that it took about a century for the full impact of the steam engine to make itself felt during the course of the Industrial Revolution. That it took about 50 years for electrical power to make have its maximum impact or its first full impact. But when you stop to realize that the first automated accounting systems were introduced in American banks and insurance companies as recently as 7 or 8 years ago, and that today about 50% of American banks are in the process of converting to these processes, you have some idea of the astonishing speed with which this new revolution is moving, quite unlike the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, it seems to me in the third place that automation differs from the Industrial Revolution in that the order of magnitude is entirely different. The steam engines were, I'm told, about 10 times, an order of magnitude that is, about 10 times as effective as animal power. Steam locomotives and automobiles were 10 times faster than animal-drawn vehicles. The first aircraft were about 10 times faster than locomotives and automobiles. But computers introduce changes that are of the order of 6 or 7 magnitudes of difference. They can make calculations that it might take a man a century to make. The University of Chicago's IBM 7094 does in about an hour the equivalent of 1 million man-hours of desk calculations. The largest digital computers at the present time have up to 20,000 times the speed of the smallest. Control Data Corporation's 66660 computer can do 3 million arithmetical and logical operations in a second. And the time span is related to the size of these computers. They're coming down in size from those that the big ones, the equivalent of a room size, to the size of a valise, to the size of a carton of cigarettes. And as they come down in size, the speed accelerates. And we now have a whole new generation of computers on the drawing boards, some of them operating at speeds so great that I find it quite impossible to imagine speeds of this character. And in addition to this, we have all kinds of new machines that are in process of development. Deacon, for example, General Electric's talkative machine. That is, Deacon being direct engineering access to computers. It should be perfected, I'm told, within about 2 years. And if and when it is perfected, any intelligent person will be able to use the computer to solve problems by passing a question directly to the computer in ordinary English, and will get an answer back in English, which reminds me of that story that's making the rounds of the Pentagon at the present time about the reaction of an Air Force general, a kind of Dr. Strangelove Air Force general, when a new computer was installed in the Pentagon. And the general stood in front of it and posed the first question, namely, should we build more manned bombers or more missiles? And the lights flashed on the machine and the mechanism whirled, and there were groans and grumbles and rumblings, and then the answer came out, yes. And the general was, of course, very irate, and he said, yes, what? And again the lights flashed and the mechanisms whirled, and the answer came out, yes, sir. Now, not only is the order of magnitude much different with regard to these new mechanisms, but they have instantaneous recall. They can call back, they can retrieve information that's stored, and they can keep it on such a basis that they operate upon in a real-time dimension. So that, for example, a manager who wants to make a decision in the future about a particular industrial problem will have instantaneously available to him the entire experience of that company, the entire experience of that industry, and forecasts as well, and the material will be not only as of the first of the month or the end of the month, it will be as of the day and the hour that he has to make the decision. This is one of the most extraordinary management tools that one could possibly imagine. and it isn't very far off. Now, of course, the implications of all this are really of extraordinary moment. Ray Eppert, who is president of Burroughs, made a statement recently that I think pretty much makes the point. He says the electronic computer has a more beneficial potential for the human race than any other invention in human history. That may be an exaggerated statement, but I'm not so sure. Now, I've suggested three respects to you in which this transformation of industrial production is going to differ in substantial ways from the Industrial Revolution. I want to suggest a fourth reason. I think the displacement of workers is certainly to be, in the long run, much greater. Because, of course, the Industrial Revolution had the opposite effect in the way it stimulated the employment of people. Now, when people talk about displacement in relation to automation, there are two extremes or two schools of economists with respect to this question. There are, of course, the utopians or the new technocrats, so-called, who are accused by their opposite numbers of engaging in a competition in ominousness. And these economists take a very alarming view of what the human displacement potential of automation is. And then, of course, there are the very cheerful, relaxed school of economists who assure us that there's nothing at all really to worry about here. If you will examine Fortune magazine for this month, Look magazine of this last week, and the New York Times magazine section for this last week, you will find articles by Charles Silberman, Edward Harris, and Peter Drucker, all counterattacking against the utopians, the new technocrats, and assuring us that so far as automation is concerned, this is the best of all possible worlds and no serious cause for concern. And they've come up with a very jolly image to reassure us about the consequences of automation. The image is Peter Drucker's, wherein he says, for example, that after all, when all is said and done, there is no substitute for the brewmaster's nose. Well, I'm delighted to be told this. I have a certain kind of empathy so far as brewmasters are concerned. And I'm delighted to know that the brewmaster's nose is really the key to brewing. I hope the brewmasters are required in the process forever and ever. And yet somehow I'm not altogether reassured by this kind of statement. And my instinct as a journalist tells me that there's a bit of a snow job in process here because of this assurance to everyone that there's no real cause for concern because industrial employment this last year picked up. Well, it did pick up, but when you examine into the reasons for it, what do you find? You find a pretty reliable estimate that the tax cut accounted for the fact that industry managed to come up with 1,400,000 more jobs than had been expected. Now, a forced feeding of the economy by tax cuts will have the effect, first time round, of exactly this kind of stimulation. But what about the second time round? And what about the third time round? What then? Because if you look at the performance of industry over a period, say, from 1957 to date, with the exception of this last year and the exceptional circumstance indicated, industry has not been providing many new jobs in the American economy. And in addition to this, these figures about jobs are fundamentally misleading. They are fundamentally misleading because we do not seem to recognize that poverty in today's paradoxical social and economic situation in the United States is not the same thing as unemployment. People can be unemployed and not be poor at all. They can be moving from job to job, or they can have resources. So an unemployed person is not necessarily a poor person. Now, when you turn from the unemployment figures, which these optimistic economists find so reassuring, and look at the question of poverty, you see quite a different situation. We have an estimated 40 million Americans who live or subsist at a poverty or less level of existence. And just the other day in the Wall Street Journal of January 8th, there was an extraordinarily interesting story about welfare recipients in the United States. 7,800,000 Americans are today on welfare. Now you can see that the poor are a larger category than the unemployed, a very substantially larger category. And when you look at these welfare figures, as the journal does, and you break them down into categories, you see a remarkably sharp increase in the recipients of aid to dependent children. And then you get behind those figures, and what do you see? You see that in many cases the cause is automation, because the husband has lost his job in a meatpacking plant in Chicago or in a railroad yard or whatever, and as a consequence of this and other difficulties, he is sort of taken temporary leave of the family. The wife applies for aid to dependent children, and the aid to dependent children category soars. Now, actually, the number of welfare recipients in the United States is increasing much faster than general population is increasing in the United States. Now, I do not want to suggest to you that I accept this doom and gloom school of forecasting about the displacement that automation may occasion, because I don't. I think that in the short term, it is quite impossible to say with any degree of predictability what the displacement is likely to be, because there are so many variables that enter into this situation. But I do believe that if half of what some of the long-term forecasts prove to be true, then there is a very serious long-term problem. For example, Ralph Lazarus, who is president of Federated Department Stores, said recently that within finite time, we should be able to produce all the goods and services we need in the United States with from 2 to 3% of the present workforce. And of course, we know on the basis of Department of Labor studies that we lose about 38 to 40,000 industrial jobs a week as a result of automation at the present time. Also, I think it well to keep in mind some incidental considerations that seriously affect should seriously affect one's assessment of this situation. These new machines, for example, are in many instances inordinately expensive. And because they are so expensive, it creates a compulsion to use them continuously, right around the clock. And why not? Why shouldn't you use them if the process is automated? So why do you need a 6-hour day or an 8-hour day? Why not a 24-hour day and just continue to produce and produce and produce? And in addition to this, automation and the possibility of automation is creating new pressures to redesign the product, not only redesign the product so that it can be automated, but to redesign it so that it can be made with new materials, which in turn lend themselves to automation. And this in turn is going to accelerate this whole process. And then also keep in mind that this is truly a consumer economy, that about 3/5 of the national income at the present time is made up of consumer purchasing power, that is, of private consumer expenditures. Now, against this background, every time you take a person out of the consumer category, or every time he goes on unemployment relief, you are reducing potentially consumer purchasing power. And over a period of time, this could have a very serious impact, although at the moment the impact may be altogether negligible. This, I think, is what Sir Leon Bagrat had in mind when he said in this year's Wreath Lectures in Great Britain that as long as purchasing power and increases in productivity tend to go somewhat in tandem, there isn't too much of a danger. But if the spread suddenly becomes very great here, then of course there is a problem. Now, in addition, another consideration that has to be entered into it, that has to be kept in mind, is what lies ahead. How much faster these new innovations are going to take place. I was impressed with Harold Wilson's speech at this year's fall conference of the British Labour Party, in which he said that in the next 15 years, that period of time will embrace a period of technological change greater than in the whole industrial revolution of the last 250 years. I don't know whether that's an accurate estimate or not, but I rather suspect it's closer to the, will be proven closer to the developments than you might imagine. Now, I don't mean to suggest, quite the contrary, I do not mean to suggest that automation is something that we should take with regard fearfully, or that we should regard it as an evil. On the contrary, it has within it the possibility of enormous human liberation of human energies and skills, and makes possible, in theory at least, the development of a kind of society of self-fulfillment. But I agree with Sir Leon Bagrat that we are faced with a period maybe of 30 to 50 years transition. And the question is, how are we going to make that transition? What kinds of adjustments will we have to make? And how fast will we make them? And are we prepared to make them? Because if we don't make them with some degree of efficiency and smoothness, the consequences could be very serious indeed. So I think what we have to do is to adjust our economic and political and ethical thinking to cope with some of the dimensions of this problem. Now, when I say that we should adjust our economic thinking, I break this side of the problem down into two categories. First of all, I think we are not thinking in the right terms with regard to the future of this problem. I think that what the conventional wisdom has to tell us about this is not very helpful. And what the conventional wisdom has to say is something like this. First of all, we need to increase production. We need to increase gross national production, because any increase in the aggregates of production involved will have some impact upon employment and some influence on employment. But there is, you see, a fallacy about gross national product, because you can increase productivity without necessarily increasing employment. It's quite possible to do so. And in addition to this, you get down to the extraordinarily interesting present-day problem of what it is that you are producing, because we are so obsessed with the necessity of producing that we can't terminate the production of wasteful and harmful products even. Paul Samuelson had something, I think, very interesting to say about this recently. He said, in the super-affluent society, where nothing is any longer useful, the greatest threat in the world comes from anything which undermines our addiction to expenditures on things that are useless. And so we have a situation where we do not dare do anything in certain areas of production, such as the manufacture of cigarettes, because of the implications that are involved in this situation. And mind you, gross national GNP can be increased by simply manufacturing musical toilet paper holders, electrical back scratchers, mascara for dogs and cats, advertised by Neiman Marcus in Dallas as guaranteed to, quote, to remove signs of strain, quote. Slot machines, the manufacture of slot machines is an increase to gross national product. Switchblade knives figures into gross national product. Hydrogen bombs, you see. So we have this kind of situation where we're faced with a very serious question: do we want to continue gross national product, let alone increase it, if what we are producing, so much of it falls within these categories? And I submit to you, do we want 139 million American automobiles on American highways by 1980? Do we really want that many cars on American highways? Now, the conventional wisdom also suggests tax cuts. Well, as I suggested a moment ago, first time round, it does have a stimulating effect. Will it continue to have? Will subsequent cuts continue to have the same effect? I think not. And I think that Gunnar Myrdal is very much closer to the reality of the situation when he said that instead of tax cuts, why not load down airplanes with paper currency, fly over depressed areas in Appalachia and whatnot, and drop the money? Because then the money would get into the hands of the people who really needed it and who would use it to buy things with in this economy. Whereas tax cuts, as we all know, in many cases go to the wrong class of person. We can stimulate trade and foreign trade and through foreign economic aid and so forth. A traditional remedy, not a bad one. We can go in for area redevelopment, so-called. Well, we've been doing that since 1961. We've added an estimated 35,000 jobs since 1961. A drop in the bucket. And you may or may not have noticed that that first experimental plant that was installed in West Virginia under this area redevelopment program failed about 2 weeks ago. So I would write off area redevelopment as a very significant contribution to this. Job retraining, well, job retraining has possibilities. But so far as many of today's victims of automation are concerned, they are too old, they lack the basic educational skills, in some cases they lack the IQ necessary to benefit from substantial job training programs. Although job training, too, is something that we ought to encourage. Public works. Public works is a classic remedy and should be encouraged. The shorter work week, the same thing. It should be encouraged. And it has something to offer. But you see, all of these, the remedies suggested by the conventional wisdom, are subject to one major limitation: that they assume that the society is going to remain pretty much as it is while these remedies are being applied. On the contrary, the society is changing right in the process of the application of these remedies, so that you would really need to plan in a kind of bifocal dimension. You would have to plan for the existing situation, and you would also have to plan in terms of how you wanted to transform the society itself. So for this reason, I put a good deal more reliance in the unconventional wisdom as it applies to this problem. By that I mean such factors as the following. It seems to me that national economic planning is an inescapable imperative of an automated economy. We must have national planning. We must determine priorities. We must determine allocation of resources. Because if you can produce endlessly through automated processes, somebody has to decide on the question of what we're going to produce in what volume. And then I think we should try and break the nexus between work and income, and give income to people apart from the fact that they may or may not be employed. We shouldn't find this necessarily too difficult, because Fortune magazine has recently assured us that not working is the fastest growing major occupation in the United States. In fact, non-work, says Fortune, is becoming an increasingly attractive pastime. The number of non-workers has roughly doubled in the past decade and might well double again by 1970 due to payments for Social Security, federal programs, state and local programs, dividends, interest, rent, etc., etc. And as a matter of fact, there are many devices that we could use that would be much better, for example, than our age-dependent children program and some of our current welfare programs. I like myself this Canadian baby bonus plan, which is to me very interesting because it derives not from beverage welfareism at all. It was a pet idea of the late Mackenzie King. It's been in operation in Canada since 1946. It is a howling success, and you could no more repeal it or modify it than you could change the basic factors of the governmental structure of the Dominion. And the baby bonus plan simply works this way, that parents receive $16 a month during, I think it's somewhat less than that, let's say $10 or $11 a month for each child up to age 16, on condition that the child be kept in school. This payment comes out of general funds. It goes right across the board. There's no requirement of need or anything of the sort. And it operates very, very successfully. It's been investigated by 3 parliamentary committees of inquiry. No scandals have been turned up in any of those investigations. And contrary to what some of you cynics might believe, it has not increased the birth rate in Canada at all. As a matter of fact, since 1946, the birth rate has gone down. Now, it is in this area of thinking that it seems to me that our thinking should be directed. Then, too, I think we should try and substitute or win public acceptance for the idea that social wealth is what we need to produce in this country, not affluence. Social wealth being schools and hospitals and improved educational systems and all of the things that add permanently to the wealth of the community of which we are a part, and not the kind of dizzy affluence that results in the production of such an astonishing amount of trivia and waste and whatnot. I think we need to place great emphasis upon education and greatly increase educational expenditures. I would like to see us use operational research techniques on a very big scale and direct them towards the solution of social problems. All sorts of areas of this kind, it seems to me, should be encouraged. And then, of course, I think we ought to use the wealth that we now produce, convert it to more substantial uses than we presently use it for. We have great poverty in the United States. Why don't we divert? Why don't we allocate some of the wealth we currently produce to the liquidation of the poverty problem in the United States? In New York City at the present time, for example, we have 1,400,000 people who live in a state of technical poverty. We have 3rd and 4th generation welfare families on relief rolls in New York City. Poverty is in New York City today the 3rd most prevalent cause of death in the city of New York. 13,000 deaths a year are attributed to poverty. And when we look outside the country and look at demands in the world around us and realize that last year, although there was some slight increase in the total production of foodstuffs worldwide, nevertheless, the amount per capita actually went down in 1964 as over against 1963. So maybe we ought to be able to do something about that. And we should also adjust our political thinking to these new perspectives. It is, to me, immensely ironic that when we lived in an economy of scarcity and when the idea of a utopia was ridiculous, we spawned utopian ideas and blueprints by the hundreds. And now, when we have the potentiality of actually creating a utopia, there are no utopian blueprints. We need a kind of politics that will establish some worthwhile goals and purposes to which this enormous productive potential could be adjusted. And if we don't do this, and keeping in mind that the very successes that we score productively are accountable for a great deal of the poverty that exists. Poverty today in the United States is a byproduct of our fantastic production. And knowing this, we ought to be able to devise some political thinking that would cope with this. Otherwise, we will divide the American population into that section that lives within the protection of what Andy Hacker calls the corporate umbrella, the beneficiaries of this largesse, and another group of people made up of the stagnant poor, the new poor, the hardcore unemployed, who exist as kind of subsidized consumers on a very low level, who are outside the political process, outside the social process, almost outside the economic process, with potentials for, I would say, future political instability on a very large scale. Now, finally, I wanted to touch very briefly on what is to me really the root problem here, the ethical problem. Because basically this is not an economic problem so far as the future of automation and its impact is concerned. It is profoundly an ethical problem. We need to adjust our national secular ethic, which is the Puritan ethic, the production ethic, the work ethic, to today's new realities and today's and tomorrow's potentialities. And in the absence of doing this, we're going to find ourselves in very serious trouble indeed, because we seem still to be addicted to that older work ethic. I was immensely amused by a study that the Wall Street Journal had recently about what some key West Coast top salary executives do to amuse themselves, what their leisure time activities are. Men who earn $350,000, $400,000 a year. And all of the examples were of this type. A steel company executive who had always had an idea that you could apply the concept of economy of scale to mortuary parlors. And so in his spare time, he had organized a chain of mortuary parlors in the state of California. And that's what all of them were doing on their spare time. They were working more. And they were starting new businesses, you see, because of this immensely compulsive drive that they have, which comes from another ethic, an ethic that served us very well until we began to move into this present kind of dispensation. Now, this is an ethical problem in another sense, and in a very profound sense. The sense indicated by Norbert Wiener, who was really one of the fathers of this age of automation. And not so long before his death, Wiener said this. He said, if man is merely a cog in a production apparatus, if we rate a man only as a factory hand for the cost of his daily wages, then the machine will indeed displace man over much of his range of activity. But in essence, the factory hand is first of all a human being, and only secondarily a factory hand. Here is the point. A whole lot of the work we are using men for is work which is really better done by computers. That is, for a long time, human energy has been worth as much as physical energy does. But a man couldn't generate enough energy today to buy food for his own body. The actual commercial value of his services in modern culture isn't enough. If we value people, we can't value them on that basis. If we insist on using the machines everywhere, irrespective of people, and don't go to very fundamental considerations and give people their proper place in the world, we're sunk. Now, in the long term, I think he's right, and I think that is the real issue. And as we face this issue, and as we approach this moment of truth that confronted the National Industrial Conference Board this last year, we should ask ourselves a whole series of questions. What kind of society is it that we are trying to fashion? What kind of values are the values that we would like to see stressed? What do we want to use this fantastic production potential for? Can we manage affluence? Can we use it to constructive social purposes? If so, don't we need a kind of new ethic? An ethic that says, how can I best serve the community? Not how rapidly can I get ahead in the world, but how can I best serve the community? And as a corollary of that, my right as an individual to achieve maximum self-fulfillment in any area of life to which I may aspire, because the problem of production, the problem of mere living, will in theory at least have been taken care of. And as we ponder this aspect of the problem, which is fundamentally a value aspect, an ethical aspect, I'd like to stress that the wisdom of keeping in mind something that Herman Melville said years ago. He said, "In our own hearts we mold the whole world's hereafter, and in our own hearts we fashion our own gods. We are precisely what we worship." Thank you very much.
Mr. McWilliams will now entertain questions from those of you who wish to propose them. As soon as we will allow a moment for people to go to classes. If everybody will speak up when you do have a question, you sir right here in front.
I'd like to ask you whether you think automation can be used on a full-scale level in other developed countries. Relate your answer to perhaps it seems to me that there's a concept of an artificiality in people flow around the world. In other words, the rise of the new nation states has prevented labor movement of peoples where they would be needed. And could automation be used irrespective of the level of technology, so that that if you went, let's say you're just trying to develop an undeveloped country, you wouldn't need as many people there. This would be a practical problem.
Well, I'm particularly aware of this aspect of the problem, which relates to your question, and that is the extraordinary problem that underdeveloped countries have, apparently, in holding trained personnel. They send young people off to European and American colleges and universities for graduate training, particularly in various technologies, etc. And then they find that these young people do not want to return because of the lack of facilities, the kind of regime that may apply, maybe in the power in a particular country. And as a result of this, you've got a really allocation of human resources. The people that have been trained are not back where they, in principle, should be. And there's been a lot of thinking, as you know, about how to offset this tendency. Maybe the establishment of regional centers of research and technology and development might be an answer to it, as the Israeli government seems to believe. But in any case, this is one of the major aspects of the problem, the inability to keep in the underdeveloped areas the kind of technical expertise that they would need if they were going to use the new technologies. And this, I think, is one of the major aspects of the problem.
Short of a solution, what is the mechanism by which we may reverse the problem at that?
I think that I rely heavily upon factors of inertia and boredom in the long run to reverse it. I think we will go through a period of when we are just so bedazzled with gadgets and things that we will continue to pursue them until we've had a surfeit of this, and then in a kind of mood of revulsion and sheer boredom with things, we will begin to think in other terms, and we will begin to think that getting that what is good for the Joneses in terms of the old Puritan ethic is not necessarily good for the country, and actually may not be very good for the Joneses. And we will begin to move away from this kind of concept of values and incentives and goals. And I see some indication of it at the present time, some slight indication of it. Yes?
How much of the impact of automation is based on a fear that exists in your own mind, and how much is based on scientific evidence? You cite, for example, unemployment rate, and yet it's by no means clear that the unemployment we have is entirely or even largely caused by automation. Secondly, isn't it possible that within the framework of our existing values, but by spending enough on education, medical care, and other things that we know we are badly could reduce unemployment and manage the impact of automation without changing our values and without getting rid of the ethic that has taken so long.
I think it is theoretically possible that we could do precisely what you suggest. My misgivings about it are in terms of the practical politics of it, the measure of public support that could be generated for the doing of it, and so forth. Now, it's true that there is perhaps an unreasonable fear of automation, and that this fear is having certain adverse consequences in American society today. At this National Industrial Conference Board session last year that I referred to, I was impressed by the fact that many of the speakers there said, they were key executives of American industrial corporations and that sort of thing, that they felt that this fear was one of the major personnel and management problems that they had to cope with at the present time. That it was a factor, a very serious factor in disturbing collective bargaining. That even in plants where there was no immediate prospect of automation, the fear of automation was adversely affecting employee morale and that sort of thing. And one of the spokesmen at that session, a vice president of Standard Oil, said something that was to me very interesting, considering that it was said at a National Industrial Conference Board session, that he thought that management, in view of this fear, had an obligation to say that for every job displaced, they would in effect guarantee the displaced employee with a new job. And whether they could find it within the organization or they might have to find it outside the organization, that he thought that this kind of obligation may rest on American management at the present time. Now, that's an indication of how far management thinking has moved in pretty constructive directions and under the compulsion of this fear of automation and some of the factors that it's generating. Yes? I think that there is quite a lot of thinking along that line. There's a lot of thinking in terms of sabbatical leaves of a year or more, as you will find now in the steel industry. But here again, and it's rather interesting to note, the Wall Street Journal had a recent story about one of their reporters who spent a full week with a steel worker in a steel community who was on sabbatical leave, just to see what the steel worker did now that he has a year's leave of absence from his work. And the steel worker started out in the morning by going down to the local fire station where there was an ongoing permanent pinochle game, and participated in it and told the journal reporter that he found it really not nearly as pleasurable as he thought it would be. And of course, this is what happens when you have leisure time, and it isn't related or isn't prepared for, and people don't seem to be able suddenly to set aside those old work habits and those old work compulsions and to do very much with the new opportunities that they have. But of course, over a period of time, I'm sure that they will begin to use this time. Although right now we have a paradoxical situation where the people who are gaining the most leisure time are the people in many respects least immediately capable of utilizing that leisure time, whereas the people who might utilize more leisure are the people who are working overtime. So that we have this kind of upside-down situation where the overtime rate has tended to approximate the unemployment rate.
How do you view the successful action in dealing with aggregation in Western Europe?
I know too little about it to even hazard a journalist's opinion. I'm told that the Soviet Union, for example, is currently placing very, very great stress indeed upon automation, but I don't know anything about it. I'm sure we can do something to promote it. But I do believe that it's going to be an aspect of developments themselves that are forcing us to a realization that new times do call, one way or another, for a new ethic. Now, of course, you can imagine the transition from this old Protestant Puritan work ethic to the kind of ethic that would motivate a society of self-fulfillment, in which you would have non-monetary goals. Self-fulfilling goals would take the place of the goals of trying just to get ahead in the world and that sort of thing, and you might be able to make that shift over without too conscious a movement away from your older Puritan ethic.
Precisely what kind of goals do you see in terms of besides elimination of poverty, things like this, that would be rapidly fulfilled?
Well, if you have a kind of society in which problems of basic need are taken more or less for granted, then it seems to me that through greater stress on education and so forth, you can create a situation where individuals will find and seek out what it is that they want to do, and they'll be in a position to do it. Now, I was impressed just recently with something that Ellen Winston said, who is the Commissioner of Welfare in the District of Columbia. And she strongly suggested that we might be better off today to substitute something like a guaranteed annual income and maybe jettison some of our present welfare programs. Because these welfare programs, many of them are carryover from another period. They have not taken into consideration the real problems of the new poor. And maybe it might be just better to scrap many of them and have a kind of guaranteed national income. Yes? Well, of course, there is this kind of potential. The science fiction people have been talking about this for a long time, as you know. Isn't there? I think there's a science fiction novel called *The Case Against Tomorrow*, in which the author imagines a society in which we would have reversed the order of compensation in present-day society, and we would give to the lowest social classes maximum income, on condition that they just spend endlessly for martinis and sportswear and sports goods and pleasurable activities, and make them kind of robot consumers, you see, at the very base of the society, and watch television and professional football and so forth. Now, there is a little bit of this dimension in present-day American society. Well, I think that's a very pertinent consideration because it seems to me quite evident that if you look around you in American society at the present time, you can see that there is considerable disenchantment with what we have at the present time. If this is what we originally meant when we talked about the American dream, then it's a little hard to account for some of the social pathology that comes with this kind of affluence. Drug addiction, all kinds of deviant behavior, crimes of a kind of senseless violence, alienation on the part of people who don't seem to want to accept any kind of responsibility for what goes on in their communities, all this sort of thing. I was interested, for example, in noting in a recent series started in the New York Times about drug addiction among young people. that in many cases a suggested reason for addiction was a quest for excitement, a quest to try and find something meaningful and dangerous and adventuresome to do in this kind of society, and not finding it and therefore ending up in this disastrous dead end. Now, there is a great deal of this disenchantment. There is a great deal of this social pathology that has come upon this society and in connection with its affluence. And I think it was the one note that Senator Goldwater struck, and he did it sort of obliquely in Madison Square Garden when he talked about the American dream, but that had a note of authenticity to it. I think he really touched something there for a moment. And then, of course, it escaped him. He couldn't hold on to the idea. Yes. I must say that I have misgivings on this score. I don't know what the President means when he talks about the Great Society. There are moments when he talks about it when I understand what he means. I understand what he means when he talks about the terrible devastation that we're wreaking on the environment and the fact that something ought to be done about this. I couldn't agree more. When he talks in these terms, I can understand what he has in mind. But generally speaking, I have a kind of suspicion that he thinks the Great Society is Texas, a kind of expanded Texas, you see. And I would like very much to see, I wish we had a genuine, modern, conservative political movement in this country that would challenge him fundamentally to spell out exactly what he has in mind, or more specifically than he has done to date when he talks about the Great Society. He is a Texan, you know, and he's given to a kind of Texas euphoria, as when he said at the lighting of the White House Christmas tree this year, he said, we're on the threshold of the greatest stage in human history since Christ was born in Bethlehem. Well, maybe. Maybe. I'm not so sure. I would hesitate to venture an opinion about this because I think there are tendencies in both directions. I mean, some of these, for example, when people first began to speculate about the impact of automation, they didn't think it would have much impact on the small plant, for example. Now we have a phenomenon of little automation, whereby it is found, for example, that a fairly small plant can use a computer for all kinds of purposes that were originally not anticipated, and that you could have a bank of information to which, if, for example, you could in effect tune in and get the answers to certain kinds of problems and so forth. So there may be a potential in this for a kind of decentralization that might, in the long run, do something for small and medium-sized business. But about that, I really don't know. I mean, it's just a thought. Yes, Shirley.
I think that will do it for this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attendance, and our program will pick up again after the semester recess. Good afternoon.